Murder at the Winter Market. A Miss Marple Mystery. Dear listeners, welcome back to Velvet Clues. I'm your host Connor, and I'm absolutely delighted you've joined me tonight for another journey into the world of mystery and deduction. There's something magical about settling in with a warm drink on a cold winter's evening to explore the darker corners of human nature, don't you think? Tonight's tale takes us to the festive chaos of a village Christmas market, where the scent of mulled wine and roasted chestnuts mingles with something far more sinister. If you're enjoying these stories, please do let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I read every single one and love hearing from fellow mystery enthusiasts around the world. Now, pull that blanket a little closer, and let's step into the snowy streets of St. Mary Mead, where Miss Jane Marple is about to encounter a most unwelcome Christmas surprise. Chapter 1. Snow and Suspicious Circumstances. The December morning dawned crisp and bright over St. Mary Mead, with that particular quality of winter light that made even the most ordinary cottage chimney seem touched with Christmas magic. Miss Jane Marple stood at her front window, watching the early preparations for the village's annual winter market, with the keen interest she reserved for all of life's small dramas. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically as she observed the bustling activity on the village green, where wooden stalls were being erected with military precision under the watchful eye of Mrs. Dolly Bantry. The winter market had become something of a tradition in recent years, transforming the usually peaceful village green into a festive maze of holly-decorated booths selling everything from handmade toys to steaming cups of wassail. Miss Marple had always found these seasonal gatherings fascinating, not merely for the charming displays of local craftsmanship, but for the way they seemed to bring out both the best and worst in human nature. Competition over stall placement, rivalry between the jam makers, and the inevitable disputes about pricing all provided excellent opportunities for observing the eternal dance of village politics. Quite the spectacle this year, observed Colonel Bantry, who had appeared at Miss Marple's gate with the morning newspaper tucked under his arm. His ruddy face bore the expression of a man who had been conscripted into carrying holly wreaths at an unreasonably early hour. Dolly's got the whole thing organized like a military campaign. Heaven help anyone who dares to suggest their mince pies aren't properly positioned. Miss Marple smiled gently, noting the way the Colonel's gaze lingered on the central stall where a striking woman with auburn hair was arranging what appeared to be an extensive display of Christmas ornaments. Mrs. Fellows seems to have secured an excellent location for her craft stall, she observed mildly. Right in the heart of everything. The Colonel's expression grew slightly uncomfortable. Yes, well, Vivian does have a way of getting what she wants. Always has, even back in the old days. There was something in his tone that made Miss Marple file the comment away for future consideration. In her experience, references to the old days often contained the seeds of present difficulties. Mrs. Vivian Fellows was indeed an arresting figure. Perhaps 45 years of age, she moved with the confident grace of someone accustomed to being noticed and admired. Her Christmas craft stall was a masterpiece of seasonal decoration, with handmade ornaments catching the morning light like jewels. She had arrived in St. Mary Mead only 6 months ago, taking the lease on Rose Cottage after the death of its elderly previous tenant, and had quickly established herself as a force to be reckoned with in village affairs. "Morning, Jane." Mrs. Bantry's voice carried across the green as she approached with her usual energetic stride. Her arms were full of ribbon and greenery, and her cheeks were pink with cold and exertion. "I don't suppose you'd fancy helping with the final decorations. We could use someone with your steady hands to tie these boughs properly." Miss Marple was quite willing to assist, and soon found herself stationed at a small table near the central fountain, helping to prepare the finishing touches for the various stalls. From this vantage point she had an excellent view of the market's organization and the various personalities involved in its creation. Theodore Bramwell, a newcomer to the village who had volunteered his services with the enthusiasm of someone eager to establish his place in the community. He was a thin, nervous man of perhaps 50, with the kind of precise movements that suggested a background in accounting or similar detail-oriented work. Miss Marple noticed that he carried a clipboard and consulted it frequently, as if the success of the entire enterprise depended on his careful documentation. "Mrs. Fellows," she heard him call out as he approached the central stall, "I'm afraid there's been a slight issue with your electrical connection. The fairy lights you requested will need to be repositioned to ensure they don't interfere with the neighboring stalls." Mrs. Fellows' response was immediate and decidedly chilly. "Mr. Bramwell, we discussed this arrangement weeks ago. I specifically requested that location because of the electrical access. If there are problems now, they should have been identified during the planning phase." Miss Marple's ears, sharp as ever despite her years, caught the edge in the exchange. There was clearly more tension between the market coordinator and the craft stall proprietor than a simple disagreement about fairy lights would warrant. She watched as Mr. Bramwell's face flushed red and his grip tightened on his clipboard. "I understand your concern," he replied stiffly, "but health and safety regulations must take precedence over individual preferences. The electrical inspector has specific requirements that must be met." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patricia Henley, the village's newest resident, and a recent addition to Dr. Haydock's practice. She was a woman of perhaps 35 with prematurely grey hair, and the kind of serious expression that suggested she took her professional responsibilities very seriously indeed. She carried a medical bag and wore the slightly harried look of someone who had been called away from more pressing duties. "I do hope this won't take long," she said to Mr. Bramwell, consulting a pocket watch with professional efficiency. "I have several patients to visit this morning, and the weather forecast suggests we may have snow before evening." "Of course, Doctor. This is just a routine safety inspection of the food preparation areas. We want to ensure that all the hot food stalls meet proper hygiene standards." Miss Marple found herself wondering why a medical inspection was necessary for what was essentially a village craft fair, but she supposed that modern regulations required such precautions. Still, Dr. Henley's obvious reluctance to be involved suggested this was not a routine matter. As the morning progressed, more vendors arrived to set up their stalls. There was Mrs. Agnes Thornfield, an elderly woman who had been making Christmas puddings for the village for over 30 years, and who guarded her recipe with the ferocity of a state secret. Her stall was positioned near the edge of the green, where the aroma of spices and brandy created an almost intoxicating cloud of Christmas spirit. Young Timothy Fletcher had erected a small booth selling handcrafted wooden toys, each one carved with meticulous attention to detail. He was a quiet young man who had recently returned from university with a degree in engineering, but who seemed to find more satisfaction in traditional woodworking than in modern technology. Miss Marple noticed that his eyes followed Mrs. Fellows with the kind of intensity that suggested more than casual interest. As she tied another ribbon bow, Miss Marple reflected on the curious dynamics that were already emerging among the market participants. Competition, attraction, resentment and ambition, all the usual human emotions that made village life so endlessly fascinating. The winter market promised to be an excellent opportunity for observing these forces in action. The first snowflakes began to fall just as the church clock struck 11, dusting the holly wreaths and wooden stalls with a coating of white that made the entire scene look like something from a Christmas card. Miss Marple pulled her shawl closer and continued her work, unaware that before the day was over, the pristine snow would be stained with something far darker than she could have imagined. Chapter 2. The Scent of Cinnamon and Secrets. By midday, the winter market had transformed the village green into a bustling maze of festive commerce. The snow continued to fall in gentle flakes, adding to the magical atmosphere as villagers and visitors from neighboring towns wandered between the stalls, their arms laden with packages, and their faces bright with seasonal cheer. Miss Marple had positioned herself at Mrs. Bantry's information booth, ostensibly to help direct visitors, but actually to maintain her excellent vantage point for observing the various dramas unfolding around her. The aroma of mulled wine and roasted chestnuts filled the air, mingling with the sharper scents of pine boughs and the sweet perfume of Mrs. Thornfield's Christmas puddings. Miss Marple's trained nose also detected something else. The distinctive smell of wood polish and lacquer that emanated from Timothy Fletcher's toy stall, where a small crowd had gathered to admire his intricate carvings. Remarkable workmanship, she heard Professor Whitmore commenting to his wife as they examined a wooden Noah's Ark complete with tiny animals. The professor was the village's resident expert on medieval history, and had the kind of scholarly precision that made him notice details others might miss. The joinery work is particularly fine. This young man has genuine talent. Timothy Fletcher's face flushed with pleasure at the praise, but Miss Marple noticed that his attention kept drifting toward Mrs. Fellowes' stall, where the lady in question was engaged in animated conversation with a customer about the provenance of her Christmas ornaments. There was something in the young man's expression that suggested his interest in Mrs. Fellowes went considerably beyond mere neighborly appreciation. Each ornament tells a story, Mrs. Fellowes was saying to her customer, her voice carrying clearly across the market. This particular angel was inspired by a piece I saw in a cathedral in Prague. The craftsmanship of the original was extraordinary. 14th century, if memory serves. Of course one doesn't see such quality in modern work. Miss Marple found herself wondering about Mrs. Fellowes' background. The woman spoke with the authority of someone who had traveled extensively and had considerable knowledge of art and antiques, yet she had chosen to settle in St. Mary Mead, a village notable more for its tranquil predictability than its cultural sophistication. In Miss Marple's experience, when sophisticated people chose to bury themselves in quiet villages, there was usually a compelling reason behind the decision. Her observations were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Henley, who approached the information booth with the brisk efficiency that characterized all her movements. "Mrs. Bantry," she said without preamble, "I need to speak with you about the food safety arrangements. I've completed my inspection of the hot food stalls, and I'm afraid there are several concerns that need to be addressed immediately." Mrs. Bantry's face fell. "Oh dear, what sort of concerns? We've been so careful about following all the regulations. It's primarily Mrs. Thornfield's pudding stall," Dr. Henley replied, consulting a small notebook. "The storage temperature for the custard sauce is borderline unsafe, and there are questions about the alcohol content in the puddings themselves. Technically they should be classified as containing alcoholic beverages, which requires special licensing." Miss Marple watched Mrs. Thornfield's face as Dr. Henley's words carried across the market. The elderly woman's expression shifted from confusion to indignation to something approaching panic. Mrs. Thornfield had been making Christmas puddings for village events for decades without anyone questioning her methods or ingredients. "Bureaucratic nonsense," muttered Colonel Bantry, who had appeared at Miss Marple's shoulder. "Agnes Thornfield's puddings have been a village tradition since before that young doctor was born. Never heard such rubbish about licensing for Christmas puddings." But Miss Marple noticed that Dr. Henley's concerns were having the desired effect. A small crowd had gathered around Mrs. Thornfield's stall, and several potential customers were moving away with disappointed expressions. The elderly woman herself looked close to tears as she attempted to explain her traditional methods to an increasingly skeptical audience. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently to Mrs. Bantry, Dr. Henley could work with Mrs. Thornfield to address any concerns rather than shutting down the stall entirely. After all, these are traditional recipes that have been safely prepared for generations. Dr. Henley's response was crisp and professional. "I appreciate the sentiment, Miss Marple, but food safety regulations exist for good reason. I cannot in good conscience allow potentially hazardous food to be sold to the public, regardless of tradition." As the doctor moved away to continue her inspection, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the young woman's inflexibility. In her experience, people who insisted on rigid adherence to rules often had their own reasons for avoiding scrutiny. Dr. Henley had arrived in St. Mary Mead only 3 months ago, taking up her position with impressive credentials but very little explanation of why she had chosen to leave her previous practice in London. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors, and Miss Marple was kept busy providing directions and information about the various stalls. She noticed that Miss Bramwell seemed increasingly agitated as the day progressed, constantly checking his clipboard and making notes with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was operating under considerable pressure. "Excuse me," she heard him say to Mrs. Fellowes, as he approached her stall for the 3rd time that afternoon.
but I need to verify your insurance documentation once more. There seems to be some discrepancy in the paperwork." Mrs. Fellowes' response was icy. "Mr. Bramwell, I provided all the necessary documentation weeks ago. If there are administrative errors, they are certainly not my responsibility. Nevertheless, I must insist on seeing the original certificates. The market's liability coverage depends on having complete and accurate records for all vendors." Miss Marple watched as Mrs. Fellowes reluctantly produced a folder from beneath her stall counter. There was something in her manner that suggested this was not the first time her documentation had been questioned. Mr. Bramwell examined the papers with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for evidence in a criminal trial. As the winter afternoon began to fade into evening, the market took on an even more magical quality. Fairy lights twinkled among the holly decorations, and the warm glow from the food stalls created pools of golden light in the gathering dusk. Miss Marple had just finished helping a family from the neighboring village select appropriate gifts when she noticed a commotion at Mrs. Fellowes' stall. Timothy Fletcher was standing very close to the auburn-haired woman, his voice low but intense. Even from her position across the market, Miss Marple could see the tension in his posture and the flush of emotion on his face. Mrs. Fellowes appeared to be trying to maintain her composure, but there was something defensive in her stance that suggested the conversation was not going as either party had hoped. "You can't just pretend it never happened," she heard Timothy say as she moved closer under the pretext of adjusting a nearby decoration. "We need to talk about this properly, away from all these people." "This is neither the time nor the place," Mrs. Fellowes replied firmly. "I thought I had made my position clear." "Your position?" Timothy's voice rose slightly. "What about my feelings? What about what we—" "Please keep your voice down," Mrs. Fellowes interrupted, glancing around nervously. "People are starting to stare." Indeed they were. Miss Marple noticed that several nearby customers had paused in their browsing to observe the exchange, and Dr. Henley, who was passing with her medical bag, had slowed her pace considerably. Even Mr. Bramwell had looked up from his clipboard with obvious interest. The conversation ended abruptly when Mrs. Fellowes turned away and busied herself with rearranging her ornament display. Timothy Fletcher stood for a moment looking lost and confused, then walked quickly away toward his own stall. Miss Marple made a mental note to observe the dynamics between these two more carefully as the evening progressed. As she returned to the information booth, Miss Marple reflected on the undercurrents she had observed throughout the day. Competition between vendors, bureaucratic pressure from officials, romantic tension between young people, and the mysterious backgrounds of newcomers to the village. All the ingredients, she thought with a slight chill, that had nothing to do with the December air, for a most interesting evening indeed. The snow continued to fall, and the Christmas lights cast dancing shadows across the market stalls. Miss Marple pulled her woolen gloves tighter, and prepared to continue her observations, unaware that the evening would bring revelations far more dramatic than anything she had yet witnessed.
Chapter 3. Mulled Wine and Muddled Motives. As evening descended upon the winter market, the fairy lights strung between the stalls cast pools of warm yellow light that seemed to float in the falling snow, while the darker corners of the market green disappeared into shadow. Miss Marple had accepted Mrs. Bantry's invitation to remain for the evening festivities, which traditionally concluded with a community carol service around the central fountain. The crowd had thinned somewhat as families with young children departed for home, but a dedicated core of villagers remained to enjoy the more adult pleasures of the winter evening. Mrs. Thornfield had recovered from her earlier distress, and was doing a brisk business selling her Christmas puddings to customers who seemed blissfully unconcerned about Dr. Henley's bureaucratic objections. The elderly woman's spirits had been considerably lifted by the support of her neighbours, and she was once again holding court at her stall with stories of Christmas traditions from years past. "In my day," Miss Marple heard her telling a group of younger women, "we didn't need certificates and inspections to make Christmas puddings. Common sense and proper hygiene were quite sufficient. These modern regulations are just another way of making simple things complicated." Dr. Henley, who was passing with a steaming cup of mulled wine, paused at this comment. Mrs. Thornfield, she said with professional courtesy, I hope you understand that food safety regulations are designed to protect public health. A single case of food poisoning could ruin Christmas for an entire family. Poppycock, replied Mrs. Thornfield with the authority of age and experience. I've been making Christmas puddings for 40 years and I've never poisoned anyone yet. These newfangled rules are just bureaucracy run mad. Miss Marple noticed that several nearby customers murmured agreement with Mrs. Thornfield's assessment. Dr. Henley's insistence on strict compliance with regulations was clearly not popular with the traditional-minded villagers of St. Mary Mead. The young doctor's face showed a flash of irritation before she composed herself and moved away without further comment. Timothy Fletcher had returned to his toy stall but seemed unable to concentrate on his customers. Miss Marple observed him glancing repeatedly toward Mrs. Fellow's booth where the lady in question was engaged in animated conversation with Professor Whitmore about the historical accuracy of her Christmas ornament designs. There was something almost painful in the young man's obvious longing, and Miss Marple found herself feeling genuinely sorry for him. Handsome young fellow, commented Mrs. Bantry following Miss Marple's gaze, but he's been mooning over Vivian Fellows ever since she arrived in the village, quite obviously smitten, though I can't say she seems to encourage his attentions. Indeed, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, though one does wonder what might have passed between them to create such intensity of feeling. Young Mr. Fletcher seemed quite distressed during their conversation this afternoon. Well, you know how these things are with young people, Mrs. Bantry said with the wisdom of experience. All passion and drama over what's probably nothing more than a misunderstood glance or an invitation that wasn't forthcoming. But Miss Marple suspected there was more to the situation than youthful romantic disappointment. Timothy Fletcher's anguish seemed too deep for a simple case of unrequited attraction, and Mrs. Fellow's defensive response suggested she was aware of obligations or complications that made the young man's attentions unwelcome. Mr. Bramwell had established himself at a small table near the central fountain, where he was conducting what appeared to be an impromptu accounting session with several of the vendors. Miss Marple could see him making careful notes as each stall owner reported their sales figures for the day. His concentration was intense, almost obsessive, and she noticed that his hands shook slightly as he wrote. Quite the perfectionist are Mr. Bramwell, observed Colonel Bantry, who had appeared at Miss Marple's side with 2 cups of mulled wine. Dolly says he's been checking and rechecking every detail of this market for weeks. You'd think he was organizing a state dinner rather than a village Christmas fair. Miss Marple accepted the mulled wine gratefully, inhaling the warm aroma of cinnamon and cloves. Perhaps he simply wants to make a good impression. After all, he's new to the village, and this is his first major volunteer project. Perhaps the Colonel agreed, though his tone suggested skepticism. Though Dolly mentioned that he's been asking rather pointed questions about the market's finances, wants to know where every penny goes and who's responsible for what expenses, seems a bit excessive for a charitable event. This information interested Miss Marple considerably. In her experience, people who showed unusual concern about financial details often had personal reasons for their vigilance. She made a mental note to observe Mr. Bramwell's interactions with the other vendors more carefully. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere of the market began to change subtly. The cheerful bustle of the afternoon gave way to a more intimate gathering of villagers who knew each other well and felt comfortable sharing gossip and observations. Miss Marple found herself privy to several interesting conversations as she moved between the stalls, ostensibly admiring the various goods on offer. I don't care what anyone says, she heard Mrs. Fletcher telling her friend Mrs. Jameson as they examined Timothy's wooden toys, that Fellow's woman is trouble. Mark my words, no good will come of her settling in our village. Oh, surely you're being too harsh, Mrs. Jameson replied. She seems perfectly pleasant, and her craftsmanship is certainly impressive. Pleasant enough on the surface, Mrs. Fletcher conceded, but there's something about her that doesn't ring true. All those stories about traveling in Europe and studying art, convenient tales that can't be verified if you ask me. Miss Marple filed this conversation away with interest. Mrs. Fletcher was Timothy's aunt and had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 15. Her protective instincts regarding her nephew were understandable, but her comments about Mrs. Fellows suggested she might have specific reasons for her suspicions. The conversation was interrupted by a sudden commotion near Mrs. Fellows' stall. Dr. Henley was standing before the display of Christmas ornaments, her face pale and her medical bag clutched tightly in her hands. Mrs. Fellows herself had gone quite white and was staring at the doctor with an expression that might have been recognition or fear. "I'm sorry," Dr. Henley said in a voice that carried clearly across the market despite its low tone, "but I couldn't help noticing some of your ornaments. That particular angel design, where did you say you encountered it originally?" Mrs. Fellows' response was carefully controlled. "I believe I mentioned Prague Cathedral. It's quite a famous piece actually. Many artists have drawn inspiration from it over the years." "Yes, Dr. Henley replied slowly, "I'm sure they have. It's just that I remember seeing something very similar in a private collection. Quite recently in fact." The tension between the two women was palpable, and Miss Marple noticed that several other people had stopped their conversations to listen. Timothy Fletcher had abandoned his own stall entirely, and was standing within earshot, his face filled with confusion and concern. "I'm afraid I don't follow your meaning," Mrs. Fellows said with what appeared to be forced calm. "Are you suggesting there's something improper about my work?" "Not at all," Dr. Henley replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I'm simply commenting on the remarkable similarity to pieces I've encountered in my previous practice. But perhaps it's just coincidence." The word coincidence hung in the air like an accusation, and Miss Marple saw Mrs. Fellows' hands tremble slightly as she adjusted her ornament display. Dr. Henley moved away without further comment, but the damage to the evening's festive atmosphere had been done. As the crowd began to gather around the fountain for the traditional carol service, Miss Marple reflected on the various tensions she had observed throughout the day: financial irregularities, romantic complications, professional rivalries, and now what appeared to be suspicions about the authenticity or legitimacy of Mrs. Fellows' artistic work. The winter market was proving to be a most educational venue for studying human nature in all its complexity. The first notes of Silent Night rose into the snowy air, but Miss Marple found herself thinking that the evening was anything but silent, and that the peace promised by the season might prove elusive indeed. Chapter 4: Shadows Among the Holly Wreaths. The carol service around the fountain created a circle of warm light in the heart of the winter market, with villagers gathering close together against the December cold. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe the faces of the singers, finding that people often revealed their true feelings when they thought others were focused on the music. The traditional melodies seemed to ease some of the tension that had been building throughout the evening, though she noticed several individuals whose attention wandered from the caroling to more earthly concerns. Dr. Henley stood at the edge of the group, her medical bag still clutched in her hand as if she expected to be called away at any moment. Her eyes kept returning to Mrs. Fellows, who had positioned herself directly opposite across the circle. The tension between the two women was palpable, despite the peaceful nature of the gathering, and Miss Marple wondered what knowledge Dr. Henley possessed that could cause such obvious discomfort to the normally self-assured Mrs. Fellows. Timothy Fletcher's voice cracked noticeably during the first Noel, his attention divided between the caroling and his obvious concern for Mrs. Fellows. His aunt, Mrs. Fletcher, kept a protective arm around his shoulders, and shot disapproving glances across the circle whenever she thought Mrs. Fellows wasn't looking. The family dynamic was complex, Miss Marple observed, with Timothy caught between his romantic feelings and his aunt's obvious disapproval. Mr. Bramwell had brought his clipboard even to the carol service, and Miss Marple noticed him making notes between verses. His behavior seemed almost compulsive, as if the act of recording details provided him with some sort of psychological comfort. When "O Come All You Faithful" began, she observed him consulting his pocket watch with the nervous precision of someone operating under strict time constraints. "Lovely evening, isn't it?" Mrs. Bantry whispered to Miss Marple during a pause between carols, "though I must say there's been rather more drama than one expects at a village Christmas market." That business between Dr. Henley and Mrs. Fellows was quite uncomfortable. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully.
Indeed, one does wonder what prompted Dr. Henley's comments about similarities to pieces in private collections. It seemed a rather specific observation for casual conversation. Yes, and did you notice how Mrs. Fellows changed the subject rather quickly, almost as if she didn't want to discuss the matter further? As the carol service concluded, and the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple made her way slowly through the market, ostensibly to bid good night to the various vendors, but actually to observe the dynamics that emerged when people thought the formal festivities were over. In her experience, the most revealing conversations often took place after official events had ended. Mrs. Thornfield was packing up her Christmas pudding stall with the satisfied air of someone who had overcome bureaucratic obstacles through sheer determination. Several regular customers had stayed to help her load her remaining inventory into wicker baskets, and their conversation revealed interesting details about the day's events. Ridiculous fuss about food safety, Mrs. Thornfield was saying as she wrapped a particularly large pudding in protective cloth. That young doctor acts as if she's trying to prevent an outbreak of plague rather than ensuring proper Christmas pudding preparation. Perhaps she's just being thorough, suggested Mr. Harris, the village chemist, who was helping to carry the heavier baskets. Modern medical training emphasizes prevention over treatment, you know. Modern medical training, Mrs. Thornfield snorted. In my day, doctors trusted common sense and experience. This Dr. Henley seems more interested in rules and regulations than actual patient care. Miss Marple found this assessment interesting. Mrs. Thornfield's criticism echoed her own observations about Dr. Henley's rigid adherence to protocol, but it also suggested that the doctor's professional approach might be masking other concerns or motivations. Timothy Fletcher was securing his wooden toy display with unusual haste, his movements quick and agitated. Miss Marple approached his stall under the pretext of admiring a particularly intricate carousel that rotated when wound with a small key. Beautiful workmanship, she observed gently. You have a genuine gift for bringing wood to life. Timothy's face flushed with pleasure despite his obvious distress. Thank you, Miss Marple. I find woodworking much more satisfying than the engineering work I studied at university. There's something honest about creating beautiful things with your hands. Indeed there is. I imagine it requires considerable patience and attention to detail. Miss Marple paused, then added casually, I noticed you seemed somewhat troubled this evening. I hope nothing has spoiled your enjoyment of the market. Timothy's hands stilled on the carousel he was wrapping. It's just, sometimes you think you understand someone, and then you discover there are things about them you never knew. Important things that change everything. Miss Marple's ears pricked up at this revelation. That can be quite unsettling, especially when one has formed strong feelings about a person. Exactly, Timothy said, his voice carrying a note of desperation. When someone you care about turns out to have secrets, it makes you question everything you thought you knew. Before Miss Marple could pursue this intriguing line of conversation, Mrs. Fletcher appeared at Timothy's side with the determined air of someone interrupting a potentially dangerous discussion. Timothy dear, we really must be getting home. The snow is getting heavier, and you know how difficult the lane becomes in bad weather. Timothy's aunt had clearly been eavesdropping, and was concerned about what her nephew might reveal. Miss Marple filed this observation away with interest, wondering what secrets Timothy Fletcher had discovered about Mrs. Fellows that could cause such obvious anguish. As the market began to close down for the evening, Miss Marple noticed that Dr. Henley had lingered near Mrs. Fellows' stall, apparently waiting for an opportunity for private conversation. When most of the other vendors had departed, she approached the craft stall with the determined stride of someone who had made an important decision. Mrs. Fellows, she said without preamble, I think we need to discuss those ornament designs more thoroughly, perhaps somewhere more private than a public market. Mrs. Fellows' response was immediately defensive. I don't see what there is to discuss, Dr. Henley. My work is entirely original, inspired by various historical sources that are well documented. I'm sure they are, Dr. Henley replied, though her tone suggested skepticism. However, I have specific knowledge about certain pieces that went missing from a private collection in London approximately 6 months ago, pieces that bear a remarkable resemblance to some of your current work. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence, and Miss Marple saw Mrs. Fellowes' face go completely white. Timothy Fletcher, who had been loading his aunt's car nearby, dropped the box he was carrying and stared at the two women with obvious shock. "I think, Mrs. Fellowes said with carefully controlled dignity, that you are making serious accusations without proper evidence. If you have concerns about my work, I suggest you take them up with the appropriate authorities rather than conducting a public inquisition." "Perhaps I will, Doctor," Henley replied quietly. "I have colleagues in London who would be very interested in examining your collection more closely." As Dr. Henley walked away, Mrs. Fellowes stood frozen beside her stall, her hands gripping the edge of her display table so tightly that her knuckles showed white. Timothy Fletcher started toward her, then stopped, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the layers of deception and hidden knowledge that seemed to surround the winter market's participants. Dr. Henley clearly suspected Mrs. Fellowes of involvement in art theft, while Timothy had apparently discovered some troubling secret about the woman he had been pursuing romantically. Mr. Brownwell's obsessive attention to financial details suggested his own hidden agenda, and even Mrs. Thornfield's defiance of food safety regulations hinted at deeper issues about authority and change in the village. As she made her way home through the falling snow, Miss Marple reflected that the winter market had provided an excellent case study in human nature under pressure. Competition, secrecy, romantic tension and professional rivalry had all been on display, creating exactly the sort of volatile mixture that in her experience often led to dramatic consequences. The snow continued to fall, covering the market stalls with a pristine white blanket that would remain unmarked until morning. Miss Marple had no way of knowing that before the sun rose again, that pristine snow would tell a very different story indeed. Chapter 5: The Locked Stall and the Missing Key. Miss Marple woke the following morning to find St. Mary Mead transformed by the night's snowfall. From her bedroom window, she could see that the winter market stood silent and white beneath a blanket that sparkled in the early morning sunshine. The individual stalls were barely visible as separate structures, appearing instead as mysterious mounds that might have contained anything at all. It was, she reflected, rather like looking at a village frozen in time, waiting for some magical word to restore it to life. Her morning routine was interrupted by the urgent ringing of her doorbell. Mrs. Bartrey stood on the doorstep, her face flushed with cold and excitement, clearly bursting with news that couldn't wait for a more civilized hour. "Jane, you must come at once," she announced breathlessly. "There's been the most terrible discovery at the market. Mrs. Fellowes is dead, and the police are saying it looks like murder." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had been clicking steadily as she worked on a Christmas scarf, fell silent in her lap. Dead? But how? When was she discovered? Timothy Fletcher found her this morning, when he came to collect some tools he'd left at his stall. She was inside her booth, locked in from the outside. The poor boy is beside himself with grief and shock. Mrs. Bartrey paused to catch her breath. Inspector Slack is already there, asking questions and making everyone nervous with his officiousness. Miss Marple rose immediately, gathering her coat and gloves with the efficient movements of someone who understood that time might be crucial in such matters. Was there any sign of how she died? Any obvious cause? That's just it. No one seems to know. Dr. Henley examined the body and says there are no visible wounds or signs of violence. But the stall was definitely locked from the outside, which means someone trapped her in there deliberately. Mrs. Bartrey's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're saying she might have been poisoned." As they made their way through the snowy streets toward the village green, Miss Marple's mind was already working through the implications of what she had heard. A locked room mystery, or in this case a locked stall mystery, suggested premeditation and careful planning. The killer had not only murdered Mrs. Fellowes, but had taken steps to ensure she couldn't escape or call for help. The winter market presented a dramatically different scene from the cheerful bustle of the previous evening. Police constables had cordoned off Mrs. Fellowes' stall with official tape, while Inspector Slack stood nearby interviewing witnesses with his characteristic blend of authority and irritation. The other vendors had gathered in small groups, their faces showing the mixture of shock, curiosity, and fear that such events inevitably produced. Timothy Fletcher sat on a bench near the fountain, his head in his hands and his shoulders shaking with either cold or emotion. His aunt, Mrs. Fletcher, stood protectively beside him, one hand on his shoulder, and her eyes fixed on Inspector Slack with obvious hostility. Miss Marple approached them carefully, understanding that grief and shock could make people either more or less willing to share important information. "Timothy," she said gently, settling herself on the bench beside him, "I'm so very sorry for your loss. This must be a terrible shock for you." The young man looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, and his face pale with anguish. "I can't believe she's gone, Miss Marple. Yesterday evening, despite everything that was said, I was hoping we could work things out. And now, everything that was said." Miss Marple repeated carefully, "Do you mean Dr. Henley's comments about the ornament designs?" Timothy nodded miserably. "That, and other things. Vivian had been trying to tell me something for weeks, but I kept pushing her to commit to our relationship instead of listening to what she really needed to say." Mrs. Fletcher's grip tightened on her nephew's shoulder. "Timothy, dear, you mustn't blame yourself. Whatever secrets that woman was keeping, they had nothing to do with your feelings for her." Miss Marple noted the emphasis on that woman, and the clear implication that Mrs. Fletcher had suspected Mrs. Fellows of deception all along. "What sort of secrets?" she asked gently. Before Timothy could answer, Inspector Slack's voice cut across their conversation. "Mr. Fletcher, I need to speak with you again about the exact circumstances under which you discovered the body." Timothy stood reluctantly, and Miss Marple noticed that his hands were shaking. "I've already told you everything, Inspector. I came to collect my wood-carving tools, because I'd left them in the storage area behind my stall. When I walked past Vivian's booth, I noticed that the padlock was on the outside of the door, which seemed odd because she never locked up that way. And then," Slack prompted with professional patience, "I called out to see if she was inside, but there was no answer. The lock wasn't actually secured, the key was still in it, so I opened the door to check if everything was all right." Timothy's voice broke slightly. "She was sitting at her table as if she'd fallen asleep, but when I touched her shoulder, she was already cold." Miss Marple found several aspects of this account interesting. The padlock had been placed on the outside of the stall, but not actually secured, and the key had been left in the lock. This suggested either carelessness on the killer's part, or a deliberate attempt to ensure the body would be discovered quickly. Dr. Henley approached the group with her medical bag, and the brisk efficiency that characterized all her professional interactions. "Inspector Slack, I've completed my preliminary examination. As I suspected, there are no obvious signs of physical trauma. However, I did notice a distinctive smell that suggests possible poisoning." "What sort of smell?" Miss Marple asked with innocent curiosity. Dr. Henley hesitated, glancing at Inspector Slack for permission to share medical details with civilians. "Sweet almonds," she said finally. "Very faint, but detectable. It's often associated with cyanide poisoning, though I'll need to wait for the official post-mortem to confirm the cause of death." Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. Cyanide poisoning would explain the peaceful appearance of the body and the locked stall scenario. The victim would have succumbed quickly, leaving the killer time to secure the door and remove any obvious evidence of their presence. "Had Mrs. Fellows eaten or drunk anything at the market yesterday evening?" she asked Inspector Slack. "That's what I'm trying to determine," he replied with slight irritation. "Several witnesses saw her drinking mulled wine during the carol service, but so did dozens of other people, and they're all perfectly healthy." Bramwell approached the group with his ever-present clipboard, his face showing the strain of someone whose carefully planned event had been disrupted by tragedy. "Inspector, I've been reviewing my records of yesterday's activities, and I think I may have some relevant information." Slack turned his attention to the market coordinator with obvious relief. Dealing with facts and documentation was far preferable to managing the emotional reactions of grief-stricken witnesses. "What sort of information?" he asked. "Well, I made detailed notes about the timing of various activities throughout the day," Bramwell explained, consulting his clipboard with nervous precision.
Mrs. Fellows left her stall briefly during the early evening, approximately 30 minutes before the carol service began. She said she needed to speak with someone privately. This was new information, and Miss Marple saw Timothy Fletcher's head snap up with sudden attention. She didn't mention anything about a private meeting to me, he said with obvious confusion. Did she say who she was meeting? Inspector Slack asked. Bramwell shook his head. No, but she seemed quite anxious about it. I offered to keep an eye on her stall while she was gone, but she said she would only be away for a few minutes. Miss Marple found herself wondering who Mrs. Fellows had arranged to meet, and whether that meeting had any connection to her subsequent death. The timing suggested that whatever had been discussed during that private conversation might have sealed her fate. As the morning progressed and the police continued their investigation, Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe the reactions of the various market participants. In her experience, killers often betrayed themselves through their behavior in the aftermath of their crimes, either by showing too little emotion or by overacting their surprise and grief. Dr. Henley seemed genuinely shaken by the death, though her professional training kept her focused on the medical aspects of the case. Mrs. Thornfield appeared more concerned about the impact on the market's reputation than about the loss of life, while Mr. Bramwell's obsessive note-taking had taken on an almost manic quality, but it was Timothy Fletcher's behavior that troubled Miss Marple most. His grief seemed genuine, but there was something else in his manner, a quality of guilt or self-recrimination that suggested he believed himself somehow responsible for Mrs. Fellow's death. As the snow continued to fall, covering the crime scene with fresh white powder, Miss Marple reflected that this would prove to be one of her most challenging cases. The locked stall presented a classic puzzle, but the emotional complications surrounding Mrs. Fellow's relationships with various villagers added layers of complexity that would require careful unraveling. Chapter 6. Tea Leaves and Bitter Truths. The afternoon found Miss Marple ensconced in her sitting room with Mrs. Bantry, both women nursing cups of strong tea while trying to make sense of the morning's tragic events. The fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, providing a welcome contrast to the grey December sky visible through the frost-touched windows. Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap as she contemplated the various puzzling aspects of Mrs. Fellow's death. I simply cannot understand it, Mrs. Bantry was saying as she helped herself to another biscuit. A locked stall, no obvious wounds, and the poor woman apparently poisoned with something that smells like almonds. It's like something from one of those detective novels Raymond is always sending you. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, though I suspect the reality may prove more complex than fiction. There are several aspects of this case that don't quite fit the pattern of a simple poisoning, such as, well, for instance, the matter of the key being left in the padlock. If someone wanted to ensure Mrs. Fellows couldn't escape, why not remove the key entirely? And why use a padlock that could be opened from either side rather than something more secure? Mrs. Bantry considered this. Perhaps the killer was interrupted and had to leave quickly. Possibly, Miss Marple agreed, though I suspect there may be another explanation. In my experience, when criminals make apparently careless mistakes, it's often because they're trying to create a specific impression. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Henley, who accepted Miss Marple's invitation to join them for tea with the grateful air of someone who had spent a difficult morning dealing with official procedures and police interviews. "I hope you don't mind my stopping by," she said, as she settled into the offered chair. "I find myself rather shaken by this morning's events, and I thought perhaps talking to someone with your reputation for understanding such matters might help me process what I observed." Miss Marple poured tea with practiced efficiency. "Of course, my dear, such experiences can be quite disturbing, especially when one feels partially responsible for the circumstances that led to tragedy." Dr. Henley's cup rattled slightly against its saucer. "What do you mean by that?" "Simply that your conversation with Mrs. Fellows yesterday evening seemed to cause her considerable distress. One naturally wonders whether that distress might have made her more vulnerable to whatever ultimately befell her." The young doctor was quiet for a long moment, her professional composure struggling with what appeared to be genuine guilt. "I've been wondering about that myself," she admitted finally. "Perhaps I should have handled the situation differently." "What situation exactly?" Mrs. Bantry asked with the directness that had made her such a valued friend to Miss Marple over the years. Dr. Henley glanced around the comfortable sitting room as if assessing whether it was safe to share confidential information. I suppose it doesn't matter now, with the poor woman dead. I recognized several of Mrs. Fellowes' ornament designs from a collection that was stolen from a private home in London about 6 months ago. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their rhythmic clicking as she absorbed this confirmation of her suspicions. A collection belonging to one of your patients, a colleague actually, Dr. Margaret Westfield, who specializes in art therapy. She had inherited a valuable collection of antique Christmas ornaments from her grandmother, pieces dating back to the Victorian era. Someone broke into her house while she was away at a conference and took several of the most valuable items, and you believed Mrs. Fellowes had somehow acquired these stolen pieces? Miss Marple asked gently. Not acquired, recreated. The ornaments at her stall weren't the originals, but they were perfect copies down to the smallest detail. Too perfect to be coincidental. Dr. Henley set down her teacup with a decisive click. I thought at first she might be innocently copying from photographs or museum pieces, but when I mentioned Dr. Westfield's collection, her reaction told me she knew exactly what I was talking about. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward with interest. You think she was involved in the theft? I think she had detailed knowledge of pieces that were stolen, which suggests either direct involvement or contact with whoever took them. Either way, I felt obligated to pursue the matter. Miss Marple considered the implications of this revelation. If Miss Fellowes had indeed been connected to art theft, it provided a possible motive for murder. Someone might have killed her to prevent exposure, or perhaps to eliminate a partner who had become a liability. Did you mention your suspicions to anyone else? She asked. Dr. Henley flushed slightly. I spoke to Timothy Fletcher about it this morning, after we discovered the body. I thought he should know what sort of person he'd been involved with, and how did he react? He was devastated, of course. Apparently she had been trying to tell him something important for weeks, but he hadn't been listening. Now he feels terrible that he might have helped her if he'd paid more attention to what she was trying to say. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. Timothy Fletcher's guilt made more sense now. He believed his romantic persistence had prevented Mrs. Fellowes from confessing her troubles and seeking help. There's something else, Dr. Henley continued hesitantly. When I examined the body this morning, I found something in Mrs. Fellowes' coat pocket that might be significant. She reached into her medical bag and withdrew a small piece of paper. Inspector Slack said I could show this to you since you've helped with village mysteries before. The paper was a handwritten note, obviously composed in haste. Meet me at the storage shed behind the market at 8:30. We need to discuss your future in this village. Come alone and tell no one, or the consequences will be severe. A concerned citizen. Miss Marple examined the note carefully, noting the generic phrasing and the anonymous signature. This was in her pocket when you found her. Yes, folded up small as if she'd been carrying it for some time. The paper is slightly damp from the snow, but the ink hasn't run, so it was written recently. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured. The phrasing suggests someone who wanted to sound official or authoritative, but the anonymity indicates they didn't want to be identified. Either they were afraid of Mrs. Fellowes, or they were planning something that required concealing their identity. Mrs. Bantry studied the note over Miss Marple's shoulder. Could this be connected to her death? Perhaps she went to this meeting and was killed there. It's certainly possible, Miss Marple agreed. Though there are practical problems with that theory. Mrs. Fellowes was found in her own stall, not at any storage shed. Either she never went to the meeting, or she was killed elsewhere and moved to the stall afterward. Dr. Henley shook her head. Moving a body would have been extremely difficult given the layout of the market and the number of people around during the evening. I think she was killed where she was found. Then perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, the meeting was moved to her stall for some reason. Or perhaps this note was meant to lure her away from the market entirely, but something went wrong with the plan. As the afternoon progressed and their discussion continued, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the various relationships and rivalries that had been on display at the winter market. Dr.
Henley's revelation about the stolen art collection added a new dimension to the case, but it also raised questions about timing and motive that would need careful consideration. The note in Mrs. Fellowes' pocket suggested premeditation, but the unlocked padlock implied either carelessness or a desire for the body to be discovered quickly. These contradictory elements suggested either a very clever killer who was trying to confuse the investigation, or multiple people involved in the crime with different objectives. As Dr. Henley prepared to leave, Miss Marple posed one final question. In your professional opinion, how long would cyanide poisoning take to prove fatal? That would depend on the dose and method of administration, the doctor replied. In powder form mixed with food or drink, it could work within minutes. Why do you ask? I'm trying to understand the timeline of events. If Mrs. Fellowes was poisoned during the carol service, as seems likely, then someone had to act very quickly to get her into the stall and lock it before she succumbed to the poison. As evening fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat alone in her sitting room, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she worked through the various possibilities. The Winter Market mystery was proving to be a complex web of personal relationships, professional rivalries, and criminal activity that would require all her considerable powers of observation and deduction to unravel. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the village, a killer was probably feeling quite pleased with their handiwork. But Miss Marple had dealt with overconfident murderers before, and she had learned that pride often proved to be their downfall. Chapter 7. Footprints in fresh snow. Miss Marple woke early the next morning with the peculiar sense of urgency that often accompanied her involvement in criminal investigations. The snow had stopped falling during the night, leaving the village blanketed in pristine white that would preserve any evidence of nocturnal activities. She dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where she prepared a thermos of hot tea and gathered the supplies necessary for a thorough examination of the Winter Market crime scene. The morning air was crisp and still, with that particular quality of silence that comes after a heavy snowfall. Miss Marple's breath formed small clouds as she walked toward the village green, her trained eyes already scanning for signs of disturbance in the snow-covered landscape. In her experience, criminals often returned to crime scenes, driven by curiosity, guilt, or the need to remove evidence they had overlooked in their initial haste. The police tape around Mrs. Fellowes' stall fluttered in the slight breeze, but otherwise the market stood empty and silent. Miss Marple positioned herself on a bench near the fountain, where she could observe the entire area while appearing to be simply enjoying the winter morning. She had learned over the years that patience was often more valuable than urgent action when it came to solving mysteries. Her vigil was rewarded within the hour. Timothy Fletcher appeared at the edge of the market, moving with the hesitant gait of someone who was drawn to a place they knew they shouldn't visit. He paused near his own stall, apparently gathering courage, then walked slowly toward the cordoned area where Mrs. Fellowes had died. Miss Marple watched with interest as the young man stood before the locked stall, his shoulders shaking with what appeared to be grief, but it was his behavior over the next few minutes that truly caught her attention. Timothy began walking in a careful pattern around the stall, his eyes fixed on the ground as if he were searching for something specific. "Looking for something, dear?" Miss Marple called out gently, causing Timothy to spin around with obvious shock. "Miss Marple, I didn't see you there." His face flushed red with embarrassment. I couldn't sleep, and I thought perhaps you might find something the police had missed," she suggested kindly. "That's quite understandable. Grief often makes us feel we must do something active to help, even when there's little practical action to be taken." Timothy's relief at her sympathetic tone was evident. "Actually, I was looking for something I think I might have dropped yesterday, a small wooden token that belonged to my father. I had it with me during the carol service, and I noticed this morning that it was missing." Miss Marple found this explanation plausible but incomplete. "A sentimental piece, I imagine. What does it look like?" "It's carved in the shape of a small angel, about the size of a coin. My father made it when I was a child, and I've carried it for luck ever since." Timothy's voice carried genuine emotion. "I'm particularly anxious to find it because Vivian had admired it when I showed it to her last week." This detail added a new dimension to Timothy's search. Miss Marple wondered whether the young man was looking for his father's token, or for evidence that might implicate him in Mrs. Fellowes' death. "Perhaps I might help you look," she suggested. Fresh eyes sometimes notice things that grief-stricken ones might miss. Together they began a systematic search of the area around Mrs. Fellowes' stall, though Miss Marple was more interested in observing Timothy's reactions than in finding any missing token. His movements were nervous, and his attention kept wandering to specific areas of the crime scene, as if he knew exactly where important evidence might be located. It was near the storage area behind the stalls that Miss Marple made the first significant discovery. Half hidden beneath a snow-covered tarp was a small glass vial, the sort used for storing chemicals or medicines. She pointed it out to Timothy without touching it, noting his immediate recognition and obvious dismay. "Do you know what this might be?" she asked carefully. Timothy's face had gone very pale. "It looks like the sort of container Dr. Henley uses for her medical supplies. I've seen her with similar vials when she's been treating patients in the village." This was an interesting observation, though Miss Marple noticed that Timothy seemed to know more about Dr. Henley's equipment than casual observation would warrant. She made a mental note to explore this connection further. Their search was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who approached with his characteristic blend of authority and irritation. His expression suggested he was not pleased to find civilians investigating his crime scene. "Mr. Fletcher, Miss Marple, I thought I made it clear that this area was off limits to the public," he said with official disapproval. "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple replied smoothly. "We were simply looking for a personal item that Mr. Fletcher believes he might have dropped yesterday. Though I think you should be aware that we've found something that might be relevant to your investigation." She directed Slack's attention to the glass vial, explaining the circumstances of its discovery and Timothy's identification of its probable source. The inspector examined the container carefully, noting that it contained traces of a clear liquid and smelled faintly of almonds. "I'll need to have this analyzed immediately," he said, producing an evidence bag. "If this contained cyanide, it could be the murder weapon we've been looking for." Timothy's distress was obvious. "But surely Dr. Henley wouldn't. I mean, she's a doctor. She's dedicated to saving lives, not taking them." Miss Marple found his defense of Dr. Henley interesting, especially given the young man's obvious emotional attachment to the victim. Most people in his position would be eager to see someone arrested for the crime, regardless of their professional standing. "People aren't always what they seem, Mr. Fletcher," Inspector Slack observed with the cynicism of experience, "and doctors have both the knowledge and access to commit this sort of crime more easily than most people." As they made their way back toward the main part of the village, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's discoveries. The glass vial provided a possible murder weapon, but its convenient location and obvious connection to Dr. Henley seemed almost too neat. In her experience, real evidence was usually more subtle and required careful interpretation. The discovery also raised questions about Timothy Fletcher's true motivations for visiting the crime scene. His search for his father's token might have been genuine, but his knowledge of Dr. Henley's medical equipment and his immediate defense of her character suggested deeper connections than he had previously revealed. Miss Marple decided it was time to learn more about the relationships between the various people involved in the winter market tragedy. In particular, she wanted to understand how a young woodworker had become so familiar with a doctor's professional equipment, and why he seemed more concerned about protecting Dr. Henley than about seeking justice for Mrs. Fellowes. The morning sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows across the snow-covered village green. Miss Marple paused at her garden gate, looking back at the winter market stalls that yesterday had been filled with Christmas cheer and were now the scene of a murder investigation. In her experience, the most complex cases often involved people who were not what they initially appeared to be. The winter market mystery was clearly one of those cases, with secrets and hidden connections that would need to be carefully unraveled before the truth could emerge. As she prepared to continue her investigation, Miss Marple reflected that Christmas was traditionally a time of revelation and redemption. She could only hope that this particular Christmas would bring truth to light and justice to those who deserved it, though she suspected the revelations ahead would be more painful than joyful for all concerned. Chapter 8. The Doctor's Dilemma. The revelation about the glass vial had cast Dr. Henley in a most uncomfortable light, and Miss Marple found herself compelled to seek a private conversation with the young physician. She discovered her opportunity when Dr. Henley emerged from the village surgery late that afternoon, her medical bag in hand and her face bearing the strain of someone who had endured a difficult day of whispered accusations and suspicious glances. "Dr. Henley," Miss Marple called out gently, approaching with the careful consideration she reserved for wounded creatures. "I wonder if you might spare a few minutes for an old woman who finds herself quite confused by recent events." The doctor paused, her professional instincts clearly warring with what appeared to be a desire to avoid further scrutiny. "Of course, Miss Marple, though I'm afraid I can't discuss any details of the investigation that might compromise patient confidentiality." "Naturally, my dear. I was actually hoping you might help me understand some of the medical aspects of the case. As someone without scientific training, I find myself puzzled by certain details." They found themselves walking toward Dr. Henley's cottage, a small but neat residence that she had rented upon her arrival in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple noted that the garden showed signs of recent attention despite the winter season, suggesting someone who took care with details even under pressure. "I understand Inspector Slack found a glass vial that might have contained the poison used to kill Mrs. Fellows." Miss Marple began carefully. "Timothy Fletcher suggested it was similar to containers you use in your medical practice." Dr. Henley's step faltered slightly. "Yes, I've heard about that discovery. The description does sound like the sort of vial I use for certain medications, though such containers are hardly unique to my practice." "Indeed not, though I imagine the police will be particularly interested in your access to substances that might smell of almonds when administered." The doctor stopped walking entirely, turning to face Miss Marple with an expression that combined defiance with what might have been resignation. "Miss Marple, I think you should know that I have been entirely truthful with the police about my qualifications and my reasons for coming to St. Mary Mead." "I'm sure you have been," Miss Marple replied gently, "though sometimes the truth can be incomplete without being dishonest. For instance, you mentioned that you recognized Mrs. Fellow's ornament designs from a colleague's stolen collection, but you didn't explain how you came to have such detailed knowledge of those pieces." Dr. Henley was quiet for a long moment, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had been carrying a burden alone for too long. "Dr. Margaret Westfield wasn't just a colleague, she was my mentor during my residency, and more than that, she was like a mother to me after my own parents died. When her collection was stolen, I took it very personally." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "That explains your strong reaction to seeing similar pieces at Mrs. Fellow's stall, but there's more to the story, isn't there? I didn't just happen to come to St. Mary Mead by coincidence, Dr. Henley admitted. I'd been tracking the stolen pieces for months, following leads about art forges and stolen antiques. When I learned that someone matching Mrs. Fellow's description had been selling replica Christmas ornaments in this area, I applied for the position here specifically to investigate." This revelation cast Dr. Henley's presence at the winter market in an entirely new light. She hadn't been a casual observer who happened to recognize suspicious artwork. She had been conducting a deliberate investigation into Mrs. Fellow's activities. "And what did your investigation reveal?" Miss Marple asked. "That Mrs. Fellows was definitely connected to the theft, though not in the way I initially suspected. She wasn't a thief herself, but she was being blackmailed by someone who had stolen the pieces and was forcing her to create replicas to sell in legitimate markets." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. This was a much more complex situation than she had anticipated. "Blackmailed? About what?" Dr. Henley hesitated, clearly struggling with confidentiality concerns. "Mrs. Fellows came to see me professionally several weeks ago. She was suffering from severe anxiety and insomnia, and during our conversations, she revealed that someone was threatening to expose a crime she had committed years ago unless she cooperated with their art forgery scheme." "What sort of crime?" "A hit-and-run accident when she was much younger. She had been drinking and struck a cyclist, then fled the scene in panic. The cyclist survived but was permanently disabled. Mrs. Fellows has been living with the guilt ever since, and someone had discovered her secret and was using it to control her." Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. It explained Mrs. Fellow's defensive behavior and her obvious distress during recent weeks. It also provided a motive for murder. If she had decided to confess her past crime and end the blackmail scheme, the blackmailer would have had strong reasons to silence her permanently. "Did she tell you who was blackmailing her?" No, she was too frightened, but she did say it was someone local, someone who had access to detailed information about her past and who could monitor her activities closely. They had reached Dr. Henley's cottage, and she invited Miss Marple inside for tea. The interior was comfortable but impersonal, with the temporary feel of someone who hadn't yet decided whether to make a permanent home in the village. Dr. Henley, Miss Marple said as they settled in the small sitting room, I think you should know that Timothy Fletcher seemed unusually knowledgeable about your medical equipment when we found that glass vial this morning. He also seemed quite concerned about protecting your reputation despite his grief over Mrs. Fellowes' death. The doctor's cheeks flushed slightly. Timothy has been helping me with some research into Mrs. Fellowes' background. He was as concerned as I was about the art theft connection, especially after he began to suspect that she was involved in something illegal. He suspected her involvement. Mrs. Fellowes had been trying to tell him something important for weeks, but he thought she was simply being evasive about committing to their relationship. When I explained about the stolen art collection, he realized she might have been trying to confess her involvement in something criminal. Miss Marple found this explanation plausible but incomplete. Timothy Fletcher's knowledge of Dr. Henley's equipment suggested a closer collaboration than simple research assistance would require. Has Timothy been helping you with your medical practice as well as your investigation? She asked carefully. Dr. Henley's flush deepened. He's been extremely helpful, actually. He has a background in engineering, and he's been assisting me with some equipment maintenance and laboratory work. His attention to detail and mechanical skills have been invaluable. This admission explained Timothy's familiarity with medical vials and equipment, but it also raised new questions about his possible access to the materials used in Mrs. Fellowes' murder. If he had been working closely with Dr. Henley, he would have had opportunities to obtain cyanide or similar substances without raising suspicion. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she reflected on the complex web of relationships and motivations that were emerging in the Winter Market case. Dr. Henley's investigation into art theft, Mrs. Fellowes' blackmail situation, and Timothy Fletcher's divided loyalties all provided potential motives for murder.
The evening was drawing in as she walked home through the snow-covered streets, and Miss Marple found herself thinking about the anonymous note that had been found in Mrs. Fellowes' pocket. The phrasing about consequences and the demand for a private meeting suggested someone who felt entitled to judge and punish Mrs. Fellowes for her past crimes. But whether that someone was the original blackmailer, a rival victim of the scheme, or someone entirely different remained to be determined. Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that the solution to this mystery would require understanding not just what had happened at the Winter Market, but what had been happening in Mrs. Fellowes' life for months before her death. Chapter 9. The Blackmailer's Last Game. The following morning brought news that significantly altered the direction of the investigation. Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just as she was finishing her breakfast, his face bearing the grim satisfaction of someone who believed he had made an important breakthrough in a difficult case. Miss Marple, he announced without preamble, I think you'll be interested to know that we've discovered who was blackmailing Mrs. Fellowes, and it wasn't who any of us expected. Miss Marple set down her teacup with the careful attention she reserved for moments of particular significance. Indeed, that does sound fascinating, Inspector. Won't you sit down and tell me what you've discovered? Slack settled himself in the offered chair, consulting his official notebook with the pride of someone who had solved a complex puzzle through methodical police work. It was Mr. Bramwell, the market coordinator. We found evidence in his lodgings that proves he had been systematically extorting money from Mrs. Fellowes for months. This revelation surprised Miss Marple considerably. Theodore Bramwell had seemed nervous and obsessive, but she hadn't detected the kind of calculating malice that successful blackmail required. What sort of evidence? Photographs, letters, and financial records dating back years. Bramwell had been tracking Mrs. Fellowes' activities since she left London, building a comprehensive file on her past crimes and current activities. He even had documentation of the hit-and-run accident Dr. Henley mentioned. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. How did he come to know so much about Mrs. Fellowes' background? Such detailed investigation requires considerable resources and expertise. That's the interesting part. Slack continued with obvious satisfaction. Bramwell wasn't just a retired accountant looking for volunteer work. He was a former insurance investigator who specialized in fraud cases. He had the skills and connections necessary to uncover Mrs. Fellowes' secrets. This background explained Mr. Bramwell's obsessive attention to detail and his nervous behavior around financial matters. It also suggested a man who was accustomed to uncovering other people's secrets, and might well have seen an opportunity for personal profit in Mrs. Fellowes' vulnerable situation. And you believe he killed her to prevent exposure of his blackmail scheme? The evidence suggests as much. We found the anonymous note in Mrs. Fellowes' pocket was written on paper that matches stationery from Bramwell's lodgings. The handwriting analysis isn't complete yet, but there are clear similarities in letter formation and pen pressure. Miss Marple considered this development carefully. While it provided a neat solution to the case, something about the timing and circumstances still troubled her. Inspector, when exactly did you search Mr. Bramwell's lodgings? I assume you obtained proper warrants for such an extensive investigation. Slack's expression became slightly defensive. We received an anonymous tip yesterday evening that led us to suspect Bramwell's involvement. The caller claimed to have seen him disposing of suspicious materials behind his lodging house. An anonymous tip, Miss Marple repeated with interest. How fortunate. And I suppose this caller didn't identify themselves or explain how they happened to witness Mr. Bramwell's activities. These things happen in small villages, Slack replied dismissively. People notice unusual behavior and report it to the authorities. The important thing is that the tip led us to concrete evidence. Miss Marple found herself wondering about the convenient timing of this anonymous tip, and the remarkably complete evidence it had supposedly led the police to discover. In her experience, blackmailers were usually much more careful about preserving evidence that could incriminate them. Where is Mr. Bramwell now? I assume he's been arrested. That's the problem, Slack admitted with obvious frustration. He seems to have disappeared sometime during the night. His landlady says he left early this morning with a single suitcase, claiming he had been called away on urgent family business. This flight certainly suggested guilt, though Miss Marple wondered whether Bramwell was fleeing from murder charges or from something else entirely. A man with his investigative background would surely have been more careful about leaving incriminating evidence behind unless he had been forced to depart in unusual haste. Inspector, she said carefully, I wonder if you might tell me exactly what this anonymous tipster claimed to have observed. The details might provide clues about their identity or motivations. Slack consulted his notebook reluctantly. The caller said they had seen Bramwell burning papers in the garden behind his lodgings around midnight 2 nights ago. They claimed he appeared agitated and kept looking around as if he was afraid of being discovered. Miss Marple found this account interesting for several reasons. First, it suggested that someone had been watching Bramwell's activities closely enough to observe his nighttime behavior. Second, the timing coincided with the period immediately after Mrs. Fellowes' death, when any guilty party would indeed be disposing of incriminating evidence. Did the caller explain why they were in a position to observe Mr. Bramwell's garden at midnight? That seems rather an unusual time for casual neighborhood surveillance. They claimed to have been taking their dog for a late walk, Slack replied, though his tone suggested he hadn't found this explanation entirely convincing either. As the inspector prepared to leave, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the various loose ends that this neat solution failed to address. Timothy Fletcher's obvious guilt and his intimate knowledge of Dr. Henley's medical equipment, Dr. Henley's secret investigation into art theft, and the curious circumstances surrounding the discovery of the glass vial all suggested a more complex situation than simple blackmail and murder. After Slack's departure, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to the lodging house where Mr. Bramwell had been staying. She found Mrs. Coddington, the landlady, in a state of considerable agitation about her departed tenant and the police search of his room. Such a quiet gentleman he seemed, Mrs. Coddington was saying as she led Miss Marple up the narrow stairs to Bramwell's former room. Always paid his rent promptly and never caused any trouble. I can't believe he was involved in anything criminal. The room had been thoroughly searched by the police, but Miss Marple's trained eye noticed several details that might have escaped official attention. The furniture showed signs of hasty packing, but there were also indications that someone else had been present recently. A faint scent of perfume that didn't match Mrs. Coddington's lavender water, and a few dark hairs on the pillow that were clearly too long and too fine to belong to Mr. Bramwell. Mrs. Coddington, Miss Marple asked gently. Did Mr. Bramwell ever receive visitors during his stay here? Oh, occasionally. Nothing improper, you understand. Usually business associates or people interested in his volunteer work with the market. There was a young lady who came by several times in recent weeks, quite respectable, carried a medical bag. This confirmed Dr. Henley's connection to Bramwell, though it raised questions about the nature of their relationship. Had she been investigating him as part of her inquiry into Mrs. Fellowes' situation, or had they been collaborating in some way? Did you happen to notice whether anyone visited Mr. Bramwell on the night he disappeared? Mrs. Coddington considered this carefully. Now that you mention it, I did hear voices from his room quite late that evening. A woman's voice, I think, though I couldn't make out what was being said. I assumed it was just the wireless, but now I wonder. Miss Marple thanked the landlady and made her way back toward the village centre, her mind working through the implications of what she had learned. The evidence against Bramwell was convincing but perhaps too convenient, and his sudden disappearance might have been motivated by fear rather than guilt. If Bramwell had indeed been blackmailing Miss Fellowes, someone else might have decided to eliminate both the victim and the blackmailer to protect their own interests. The anonymous tip that led to his exposure, the convenient discovery of evidence, and his timely flight all suggested the work of someone who was manipulating the investigation for their own purposes. As she walked through the snowy streets of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected that the winter market mystery was proving to be even more complex than she had initially suspected. The solution would require understanding not just who had killed Mrs. Fellowes but who was clever enough to frame both a blackmailer and potentially an innocent investigator in the process. The afternoon was drawing in, and somewhere in the village, she was certain, the real killer was congratulating themselves on their successful manipulation of the police investigation. But Miss Marple had dealt with overconfident murderers before, and she knew that the most elaborate schemes often contained the seeds of their own destruction. Chapter 10. The final revelation at midnight. Christmas Eve arrived with a peculiar stillness that seemed to blanket St. Mary Mead in more than just snow. Miss Marple had spent the day in careful contemplation, reviewing every detail of the winter market mystery while her knitting needles worked steadily through the patterns she could complete with her eyes closed. The various threads of evidence had finally begun to weave themselves into a coherent picture, though it was not the picture that Inspector Slack's investigation had painted. As evening approached, Miss Marple made several telephone calls to key figures in the case, extending invitations for what she described as a small Christmas Eve gathering to discuss recent events. The responses varied from curious acceptance to reluctant agreement, but by 9 o'clock that evening, her sitting room contained all the principal players in the drama that had unfolded at the winter market. Dr. Henley sat primly in the wing chair beside the fireplace, her medical bag at her feet, and her face showing the strain of several difficult days. Timothy Fletcher occupied the sofa, his hands clasped nervously in his lap and his eyes avoiding direct contact with the doctor. Mrs. Bantry had positioned herself near the door, ostensibly to serve tea but actually to ensure that no one could leave without her notice. Even Inspector Slack was present, though his expression suggested he considered this gathering an unnecessary complication to his neat solution of the case. "My friends," Miss Marple began, setting down her knitting and regarding the assembled company with gentle authority, "I asked you all here tonight because I believe we have been looking at this tragedy from entirely the wrong perspective. The winter market mystery is not about blackmail or art theft, though both of those elements played important roles in the events that led to Mrs. Fellowes' death." She paused to pour tea, allowing her words to settle on the group. "The real story began months ago when 3 people became entangled in a web of secrets that ultimately proved fatal for one of them." Timothy Fletcher's face had gone very pale. "Miss Marple, I don't understand what you're suggesting." "I think you do, dear," she replied kindly. "You see, the key to solving this case lay not in the dramatic events at the market, but in understanding why Mrs. Fellowes had been trying so desperately to confess something to you for weeks before her death." Dr. Henley leaned forward slightly. "I told you about her anxiety and guilt over past events. She was being blackmailed by Mr. Bramwell about the hit-and-run accident." "Indeed you did tell me that story," Miss Marple agreed, "and it was quite convincing except for one crucial detail. Mrs. Fellowes wasn't the driver in that hit-and-run accident, she was the victim." The silence that followed was absolute.
Even the fire seemed to stop crackling as the implications of this revelation sank in. The cyclist who was struck and permanently disabled was Vivian Fellows herself, Miss Marple continued quietly. That's why she walked with a slight limp that became more pronounced when she was tired or stressed. That's why she had such detailed knowledge of certain art collections. She had been an insurance investigator herself before her accident ended her career. Inspector Slack's notebook had fallen forgotten in his lap, but the blackmail evidence, the documentation we found in Bramwell's room, was carefully planted by someone who needed a scapegoat for murder, Miss Marple replied. Someone who had access to Mrs. Fellowes' real history and could construct a believable alternative version of events. Someone with medical knowledge who could obtain cyanide and administer it effectively. Someone who was already conducting a secret investigation and had legitimate reasons for asking detailed questions about Mrs. Fellowes' background. Dr. Henley's hands had begun to tremble slightly. You're suggesting that I killed Mrs. Fellowes? That's absurd. I was trying to help her. You were trying to help yourself, Miss Marple corrected gently. You see, Dr. Henley, you were the driver in that hit-and-run accident. You were a young medical student at the time, driving under the influence of after a party, when you struck Mrs. Fellowes and fled the scene. The guilt has haunted you ever since, driving you to dedicate your life to medicine as a form of penance. Timothy Fletcher was staring at Dr. Henley with dawning horror. Patricia, tell me this isn't true. When Mrs. Fellowes arrived in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple continued, you recognized her immediately, though she didn't initially recognize you. You had changed considerably since your student days, and she had suffered brain trauma that affected her memory of the accident. But gradually, she began to remember details about that night, and she started trying to tell Timothy about her growing certainties. Dr. Henley's professional composure was cracking visibly. She was confused, traumatized. Head injuries can cause false memories, paranoid delusions, but her memories were accurate, Miss Marple said firmly, and you knew that when she finally remembered your face clearly, your career and your freedom would be over, so you decided to act first. The room was completely still except for the sound of Timothy Fletcher's ragged breathing as he absorbed the truth about the woman he had been defending and assisting. The blackmail scheme was your creation, Miss Marple continued. You needed to establish an alternative motive for Mrs. Fellowes' murder, and a convenient suspect to take the blame. Mr. Bramwell's background in insurance investigation made him perfect for the role, especially since his nervous personality and obsessive behavior would make him appear guilty when the time came. Inspector Slack had finally found his voice, but the evidence in his room, the financial records, were manufactured by someone with access to official documents and the knowledge to make them appear authentic. Dr. Henley's medical practice gave her opportunities to create convincing paperwork, and her relationship with Timothy provided access to his technical skills for any forgery work that required precision. Timothy Fletcher's face was now completely white. Patricia, I thought I was helping you investigate art theft. I thought we were trying to protect Mrs. Fellowes from criminals, and you did help, Miss Marple said sadly. Timothy assisted Dr. Henley in creating the false evidence against Mr. Bramwell, believing he was helping to solve a crime rather than cover one up. His genuine grief over Mrs. Fellowes' death was real, as was his guilt about his unwitting participation in the murder conspiracy. Dr. Henley stood suddenly, her hand moving toward her medical bag, but Mrs. Bantry was quicker, positioning herself between the doctor and the door with the determination of someone who had witnessed enough village mysteries to recognize a desperate criminal. It's over, Patricia, Timothy said quietly, his voice heavy with betrayal and sorrow. Miss Marple is right, isn't she? You used my feelings for Vivian and my trust in you to make me an accessory to murder. Dr. Henley's shoulders sagged in defeat. I never meant for any of this to happen. When I recognized her in the village, I thought perhaps I could finally make amends for what I had done. But then she started remembering, and I knew I would lose everything I had worked to build. So you poisoned her during the carol service, Miss Marple said gently, using cyanide that you had access to through your medical practice. You lured her to her stall with that anonymous note, then secured her inside to make it appear she had been trapped by a blackmailer. The unlocked padlock was meant to ensure the body would be discovered quickly, before decomposition could interfere with your planned timeline. Inspector Slack was already reaching for his handcuffs, but Dr. Henley made no attempt to resist. The fight had gone out of her completely, leaving only a broken woman who had committed murder to conceal an old crime and had destroyed an innocent man's trust in the process. As the police led Dr. Henley away, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic ironies of the case. Mrs. Fellows had been trying to forgive the person who had injured her, while that same person had been planning her murder. Timothy Fletcher had been manipulated into betraying the woman he loved by the person he had been trying to help, and Mr. Bramwell, who had fled in terror when he realized he was being framed, was still somewhere in hiding, unaware that his innocence had been established. A very sad business, Mrs. Bantry observed as they watched the police car disappear into the snowy night. All this tragedy could have been avoided if Dr. Henley had simply confessed her old crime and accepted the consequences. Miss Marple nodded, picking up her knitting once more. Fear makes people do terrible things, Dolly. Dr. Henley was so afraid of losing her new life that she destroyed it completely in trying to preserve it. Outside, the church bells began to chime midnight, marking the arrival of Christmas Day. The winter market stood empty and snow-covered in the village green, its festive decorations now seeming more melancholy than cheerful. But Miss Marple knew that time would heal the wounds left by this tragedy, and that next year the village would once again gather to celebrate the season with hope and joy. The mystery of the winter market was solved, and justice would be served. For Miss Marple, that was gift enough for any Christmas. And so concludes another mystery from the village of St. Mary Mead, where Miss Marple's keen observation and understanding of human nature have once again brought truth to light. I hope you've enjoyed this journey through the snowy lanes and dark secrets of our winter market mystery. The most complex crimes often spring from the simplest human emotions: fear, guilt, and the desperate desire to escape the consequences of past actions. If you've enjoyed tonight's tale, please do let me know in the comments, and don't forget to check back for more mysteries from Velvet Clues. Until next time, this is Connor wishing you peaceful dreams and warning you to be careful who you trust with your secrets. You never know when they might be used against you. Sweet dreams, mystery lovers.